At 11:23 a.m. on September 19, 1944, Private First Class Walter Kowalski hunkered down inside the sweltering, claustrophobic turret of his M4 Sherman tank, positioned on the edge of a sun-baked field near Ercourt, France. The air reeked of cordite, machine oil, and the faint metallic tang of fear as three German Panzer IV tanks rumbled closer, their silhouettes growing larger by the second, 800 yards and closing fast. His hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers cramped into tight fists before he forced them to relax, knowing he'd need every ounce of dexterity in the moments ahead. 2 days prior, the tank's original loader, a grizzled veteran named Joe who joked about Walter's mechanic's hands when he first joined the crew, had been killed instantly when a German Panzer round sliced through the turret's thin armor like a hot knife through butter. Walter was a last-minute replacement, plucked from a stateside maintenance unit where he'd spent his days fixing engine parts, not fighting in tank duels. Before this deployment, he'd loaded exactly 4 training rounds in his entire life, slowly, carefully in the safety of a Fort Knox practice range, with no enemy guns pointed his way. Chaos erupted around him, a cacophony of sound that made his ears ring even before the first shots were fired. The gunner, a man named Mike with a scar slicing across his cheek, shouted frantically about the turret's traverse speed, his voice cracking as he begged for the turret to swivel faster to lock on to the approaching panzers. Above them, the commander, Sergeant Raymond Miller, leaned into the turret hatch, his face red with exertion as he barked out target coordinates in a rapid staccato rhythm. 5 o'clock, 600 yards, lead him by 10 feet. While the driver, a quiet kid from Iowa named Jake, slammed the Sherman into reverse, the tank lurching backward as it crashed into a dense hedgerow, branches and dirt flying into the air. Through it all, Walter's mind fixated on one task: ram the 75mm high-explosive shell into the breach as fast as humanly possible. He reached for the first round on the ready rack, his palms instantly slick with a sticky mix of sweat and machine oil that made the shell's metal surface slippery and hard to grip. The shell weighed 38 pounds, heavy enough that his arms ached just lifting it, a physical reminder of how unprepared he was for this moment. The rigid instructions from Fort Knox's loader training echoed in his mind, drilled into him by instructors who'd never seen real combat. Grip the shell firmly with the nose pointing forward, align the brass base perfectly with the breech's opening, slam it home with all your strength, then step clear of the recoil path immediately. A skilled, battle-hardened loader could complete the sequence in 4 seconds flat. For a nervous replacement like Walter, the instructors had warned, it might take 5 seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. But Walter faced a problem no instructor had ever addressed. He was left-handed, and the interior of a Sherman turret was criminally cramped, barely 7 feet across at its widest point. When he turned to face the breach head-on, as protocol demanded, his left elbow crashed into Mike's shoulder with a dull thud. The gunner, already on edge from the approaching panzers, shoved him hard in the ribs, a snarl escaping his lips. Walter stumbled backward, the heavy shell slipping dangerously in his grip, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it over the chaos of the crew's shouts and the tank's grinding gears. Sergeant Miller's screams intensified, sharp and urgent, as the panzers closed to 600 yards, close enough that Walter could see the black crosses painted on their hulls. Desperation surged through him, a primal fear that drowned out the voice of his training instructors. He knew he couldn't afford to fumble again. One more mistake, and they'd all be dead. In that split second, Walter made a decision that violated every rule in the Army's training manuals. He turned his back to the breach. He reached behind himself with his left hand, his dominant hand feeling blindly for the breach's opening, while his right hand gripped the shell's brass base, his fingers tightening until his knuckles turned white. His fingertips brushed against the hot metal rim of the breech, a sensation that burned through the sweat on his skin, and he guided the shell's nose backward into the chamber, shoving with every ounce of strength he could muster. The breech mechanism caught the shell with a loud clank, slamming shut automatically. Mike, the gunner, didn't waste a second. He pulled the trigger, and the tank shook violently as the 75mm cannon fired. Recoil sent a wave of hot metal and acrid smoke billowing back into the turret, singeing the hair on the back of Walter's neck and making his eyes water. But he didn't care. He was already reaching for the next shell, his mind focused solely on repeating the unorthodox backward motion. 3 seconds later, the second shell was loaded. The gun fired again. His ears rang so loudly he could barely hear the crew's shouts, and cordite smoke burned his throat, making him cough. Third shell, 2.5 seconds. Fourth, a flat 2 seconds, his movements growing faster and more instinctive with each round. 6 minutes of relentless, heart-pounding combat passed before the commander's voice cut through the noise sharp and clear. 4 impacts, 4 kills. Walter froze, his hands still reaching for the next shell, as he followed the crew's gaze to a field 400 yards away, where the 4 German panzers burned brightly, black smoke curling into the blue French sky. The turret fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of the distant fires and the heavy, ragged breathing of the crew. Walter stood there, his back still turned to the breach, his hands black with powder residue, as Mike and Sergeant Miller stared at him in stunned disbelief. No one in the history of Sherman tank operations loaded a 75mm cannon backward. It violated every safety regulation, every training procedure, every line of every manual written since 1942. But in that moment, none of that mattered. It had worked. Recoil sent hot metal and smoke billowing back, singeing Walter's neck, but he didn't flinch. He was already reaching for the next round, repeating the unorthodox backward motion. 3 seconds. Breach closed, gun fired. His ears rang, and cordite burned his throat, but he kept going. Third shell, 2.5 seconds. Fourth, a flat 2 seconds. 6 minutes of relentless combat later, the commander's voice cut through the din. 4 hits, 4 kills. 400 yards away, the German tanks burned in a field. The crew fell silent. Walter stood there, back still to the breach, hands black with powder residue, as the gunner and commander stared at him in disbelief. No one loaded a 75mm cannon backward. It violated every safety rule and training protocol since 1942. But it worked. The M4 Sherman tank that Walter served in was never designed to go toe-to-toe with Germany's fearsome panzer tanks. Unveiled in 1941, the Sherman was a workhorse built for a specific purpose: to support infantry units, breach enemy defensive lines, and prioritize reliability, mass production, and easy repairs over raw firepower or heavy armor. The U.S. Army churned out 49,000 Shermans between 1942 and 1945, a testament to its simplicity and manufacturability, and in many ways it was a good tank, sturdy, adaptable, and able to operate in a wide range of terrain. But it was never intended to duel with the German military's most advanced armor, and that flaw would prove deadly for thousands of American tank crews. The core issue lay in its main weapon, the 75mm cannon. While effective against light armor and infantry positions, the 75mm gun could only penetrate 3 inches of steel at 500 yards, enough to take out a German Panzer III, but utterly useless against the frontal armor of a Panzer IV, which was thick enough to deflect Sherman shells at typical combat ranges. Against heavier German tanks like the Panther or the fearsome Tiger, the 75mm cannon was little more than a pea shooter, unable to penetrate their armor even at point-blank range. German tank designers knew this all too well. By late 1943, every Panzer rolling off the production line featured frontal armor specifically engineered to stop Sherman shells in their tracks. American military doctrine claimed that 5 Shermans could overwhelm 1 Panzer through superior maneuverability and flanking fire, a strategy that looked good on paper but proved catastrophic in practice. On the ground, it meant that 4 out of every 5 Sherman crews would die trying to get into position for that decisive flanking shot, sacrificing themselves so that 1 crew might survive. Crews in the European theater came to call this grim reality the death ratio, a term that summed up the brutal odds they faced every time they rolled into combat. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces pushed through France after the D-Day landings, the statistics were staggering. For every German tank destroyed, the Allies lost 4, sometimes 5, Shermans. The carnage reached horrific heights in battles like the one at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, where a single German Tiger tank, commanded by the legendary ace Michael Wittmann, wiped out 25 Allied tanks in just 15 minutes, leaving a trail of burned-out hulls and dead crewmen in its wake. A month later, at the Battle of Goodwood in July, British tank units lost 200 Shermans in a single day as they tried to push through German lines south of Caen, their advance halted by a combination of heavy armor and well-placed anti-tank guns. Every tanker in France had seen the aftermath of such battles. Burned-out Shermans lining the roads, their turrets blown off by enemy fire, crewmen pulled from the wreckage, their bodies scarred by burns and shrapnel, the sickening sight of tanks brewing up, military slang for the catastrophic explosion that occurred when a Panzer round ignited a Sherman's ammunition stores. The loader, positioned directly next to the ready rack, where 20 high-explosive shells were stored, was often the first to die in such explosions, caught in the blast before they could even react. For Walter and his fellow replacements, these sites were a constant reminder that their training had barely prepared them for the horrors of real combat. In this lopsided battle of armor, speed became the only real advantage an American tank crew had. And speed, in tank combat, meant one thing: rate of fire. The first tank to land a hit almost always won, and that meant the loader's speed was a matter of life or death. A skilled loader using the Army's standard method could load a 75mm shell in 4 to 5 seconds, but Walter's recent injury had made even that basic task nearly impossible. 2 days before the Ericourt fight, during a minor skirmish near the village of Rach, a German Panzer round had struck their turret's glacis plate at a sharp angle. The armor held, deflecting the round upward, but the impact was so powerful that it threw Walter against the turret's metal wall with bone-crunching force, dislocating his right shoulder. The battalion medic had popped the shoulder back into place, but the pain was searing, and Walter could barely lift his arm above his waist, let alone lift a 38-pound shell using the standard two-handed method taught at Fort Knox. The medic had told Walter he was done, finished as a loader, but in the 4th Armored Division, replacements were in short supply. The division was already 12 tanks short of full strength, and in the past week alone, 36 loaders had been killed or wounded. There was no one to take Walter's place, and Sergeant Miller, a pragmatic commander who valued survival over regulations, made a risky choice. He told Walter to stay with the crew. "We'll figure something out," Miller had said, his voice gruff but determined, and Walter had nodded, grateful for the chance to prove he wasn't useless. The next morning, September 18, 1944, the crew's resolve was put to the test when 3 German panzers emerged from the early morning fog at 900 yards, their guns already trained on Walter's Sherman. Sergeant Miller ordered Mike to engage, and Walter reached for the first shell, his left hand trembling as he grabbed it from the ready rack. He tried the standard method, turning to face the breach head-on and attempting to lift the shell with both hands, but the moment he put weight on his right shoulder, a wave of agony shot through his arm. The shell tilted dangerously, starting to slip from his grip, and Mike shouted at him to hurry, his voice laced with panic. The panzers were closing fast, 800 yards now, and Walter could hear the whine of their engines growing louder. Panic surged through him, a primal fear that clouded his judgment and made him act on instinct rather than training. He turned his back to the breach, a move that felt wrong and dangerous, and reached behind himself with his left hand, feeling blindly for the breach's opening, like a blind man searching for a door handle. His fingers brushed against the hot, smooth rim of the breach, and he guided the shell's nose backward into the chamber, shoving it home with all his strength. The breech mechanism caught the shell and slammed shut, and Mike fired instantly. The recoil blast hit Walter's back, the heat searing through his uniform and burning his skin, but he didn't flinch. He was already reaching for the next round, repeating the same backward motion, back turned, left hand guiding, left arm ramming. This time it took 3 seconds. The breech closed, the gun fired again. The panzers were returning fire now, their rounds screaming past the turret with a terrifying whistle. But Walter didn't stop. 4th shell, 5th shell. His left arm burned from the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. But he kept loading, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. The engagement lasted 4 tense minutes, and by the end, They'd fired 9 rounds, hit 2 of the Panzers, and the third had retreated behind a tree line. When the shooting stopped, Walter's back was covered in painful powder burns, his left arm shaking from exhaustion, and his right arm still hung useless at his side. Sergeant Miller climbed down from his hatch and stared at Walter, his mouth hanging open, while Mike just gaped. No one spoke for a long, tense moment before Miller finally asked a simple question. How fast was that? Walter didn't know. He'd been too focused on surviving to count, but Mike had been timing him. 3 seconds, the gunner said, his voice filled with awe. Sometimes less. Faster than Joe ever was. Miller nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Keep doing it, he said. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Walter's unorthodox backward loading method worked for 3 critical reasons that the Army's training manuals had never considered: leverage, space, and natural motion. When a loader used the standard method, facing the breech head-on, they had to extend both arms forward to ram the shell home, pushing against 38 pounds of weight with their arms fully extended. Any mechanic, Walter included, knew that pushing something heavy with straight arms gave you the weakest possible leverage, like trying to open a stuck door by pushing with your fingertips instead of your shoulder. But when Walter turned his back to the breech, he completely changed the physics of the motion. Instead of pushing the shell forward with extended arms, he was driving it backward with his arm bent and his entire body weight behind it. A short, powerful motion that was like throwing a punch backward. His left arm only had to move 12 inches instead of 24, and he could use the strength of his shoulder and back muscles rather than just his triceps, making the motion faster and less tiring. The second advantage was space, or rather the lack of it, in the Sherman's turret. When a loader faced the breech, their body took up nearly 2 feet of lateral space, their elbows sticking out and their shoulders squared to the gun, which meant they were constantly bumping into the gunner, the turret's traverse mechanism, or the radio mount. Every collision cost precious seconds, and sometimes it cost the shell itself, as a fumbled round could take 10 to 15 seconds to recover. Time that was impossible to spare in combat. But when Walter turned his back, his body profile narrowed dramatically, his shoulders aligning parallel to the gun instead of perpendicular. He took up only about 10 inches of space, leaving room for the gunner to work without being elbowed and the commander to lean down and give orders without hitting Walter's head. The entire crew had more room to move, making their operations smoother and more efficient. The third advantage, and by far the most important, was natural motion. Right-handed loaders were taught to lead with their right hand, their dominant hand, which made sense in theory, but in the cramped turret, leading with the right hand meant twisting their torso to the left while reaching to the right, an awkward motion that required conscious coordination. Under the stress of combat, when adrenaline and fear took over, that coordination often broke down, leading to fumbles and wasted seconds. Left-handed loaders had it even worse. They were forced to lead with their weaker right hand, every motion fighting against their natural instincts. Walter's backward method eliminated that problem entirely. He reached behind himself with his dominant left hand, a motion that was natural and instinctive, requiring no conscious thought. Under fire, when his brain was screaming and his hands were shaking, muscle memory took over. His left hand knew where the breech was without looking, could feel the opening, and guide the shell home with precision. And the best part? It worked for both left-handed and right-handed loaders. A right-handed loader could use the same backward motion, leading with their right hand, and achieve the same speed and efficiency. The only downside was that it violated every safety rule in the Army's field manual. Walter's method worked for 3 critical reasons the Army had ignored: leverage, space, and natural motion. Facing forward meant pushing the shell with extended arms. Weak leverage. Turning back let him use his body weight and bent arm, a short, powerful motion like a backward punch. The narrow turret had less room for a forward-facing loader's elbows and shoulders. Turning back slimmed his profile, letting the crew move freely. Most importantly, it aligned with natural instincts. Left-handed loaders used their dominant hand. Right-handed loaders could adapt the same motion, and muscle memory took over in combat, eliminating fumbles. There was just one insurmountable problem: Walter's method was a direct violation of every safety regulation in the Army's official tank gunnery guide, Technical Manual 9-731A. The manual was explicit in its instructions for loaders. They must face the breech at all times, maintain visual contact with the shell during the entire loading process, use both hands in a coordinated motion, and step clear of the recoil path immediately after loading. These rules weren't arbitrary. They had been written in blood. The manual cited 3 documented cases from the North African campaign where improper loading techniques had caused catastrophic breech failures, including one incident where the entire crew was killed in the resulting explosion. Sergeant Miller knew the regulations inside and out, but he also knew that Walter's method worked. After the September 18th engagement, Miller faced a difficult choice: report the violation and lose his best loader, or keep quiet and give his crew a fighting chance to survive. It wasn't a hard decision. Miller chose silence, telling the crew to keep Walter's technique a secret, at least for now. "We'll cross the regulation bridge when we come to it," he said. "But until then, we're using what works." The crew agreed, none of them willing to give up the speed and efficiency that had already saved their lives once. After the September 19th engagement, the one that had opened with Walter's trembling hands and closed with 4 burning panzers, other tank commanders in the battalion couldn't help but notice. When your unit is losing 2 tanks for every one you destroy, you pay close attention to any crew that manages to beat those brutal odds. By September 20th, just one day later, 3 other loaders in the battalion had approached Walter, asking him to teach them the backward method. By September 21st, that number had grown to 8. None of them asked for permission. They didn't want to give higher command a chance to say no. They just started turning their backs to the breach during combat, relying on muscle memory and Walter's technique to load faster and survive. The results were impossible to ignore. Tanks using the backward loading method were firing 9 to 10 rounds per engagement instead of the typical 6 to 7, giving them a decisive edge in rate of fire. They were landing killing shots before the German panzers could respond, and crew survival rates jumped dramatically. The 4th Armored Division's overall kill ratio, which had been 4-1 against them, 4 Shermans lost for every 1 Panzer destroyed, began to shift, moving closer to even. Word of the secret technique spread through the battalion like wildfire, passed along in whispered conversations between crews and quick demonstrations behind the maintenance sheds after dark. There were no written instructions, no official training sessions, just loaders teaching each other a technique that could get them court-martialed if anyone with rank found out. But for these men, survival was worth the risk. They'd seen too many friends die because the standard loading method was too slow, too awkward, too ill-suited for the chaos of real combat. Walter's method was a lifeline, and they weren't about to let regulations take it away. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, was the first high-ranking officer to notice the unorthodox loading technique. Abrams was 30 years old at the time, an aggressive, no-nonsense commander already famous for his bold tank tactics, and he would later go on to become the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. But in September 1944, he was just a battalion commander trying to keep his men alive in the brutal fighting in France. On September 23rd, Abrams was observing a training exercise near Ericourt when he saw one of his loaders turn his back to the breech and load a shell in under 3 seconds. The colonel immediately called the exercise to a halt, striding over to the tank and ordering the crew out, his face stern with anger and curiosity. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice booming across the training field. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, knowing it was time to come clean. He told Abrams everything: about Walter's injury, about the desperate decision to try the backward method, about the results: faster loading times, more kills, higher survival rates. Miller spoke calmly, confident in the technique that had already saved his crew multiple times, and Abrams listened in silence, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never leaving Miller's face. When Miller finished, Abrams paused for 30 long seconds, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Every tanker in the exercise area was watching, waiting to see if Miller and Walter would be court-martialed for violating regulations. Then Abrams made a decision that would change how American tank crews fought for the rest of the war. "Teach every loader in this battalion to do that," he ordered, his voice firm but not angry. I don't care what the manual says. I care about kill ratios and keeping my men alive. If turning your back to a 75mm cannon does that, then that's our new standard. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief, and Miller nodded, grateful that Abrams was a commander who valued results over red tape. Within 48 hours, the 37th Tank Battalion had launched an informal training program, with Walter as the star instructor. He demonstrated the backward loading method step by step, breaking down the motion for replacement loaders and seasoned veterans alike, and experienced loaders practiced until they could match Walter's 3-second time. The training was simple and practical, no fancy drills or written documentation, just hands-on practice in the cramped turrets of Sherman tanks, the same environment where the technique would be used in combat. By October 1st, 1944, 90% of the loaders in the 37th Battalion were using the backward method in combat, and the results were dramatic. Their average engagement time dropped from 12 minutes to 8 minutes, as they were able to land killing shots faster and end fights before the Germans could respond. Their kill ratio improved to better than 1-to-1, meaning they were destroying more Panzers than they were losing Shermans, a feat that had seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. They were losing fewer tanks, destroying more enemy armor, and, most importantly, coming home alive. Other battalion commanders in the 4th Armored Division couldn't help but notice the 37th's success. They started asking Abrams what he was doing differently, and he told them the truth about Walter's method. Some commanders adopted the technique immediately, recognizing its value in saving lives. Others hesitated, worried about violating regulations and facing disciplinary action. The manual was the manual after all, and regulations existed for a reason, at least in theory. But General George Patton, the commander of 3rd Army, didn't care about theories. Patton was a man who valued two things above all else: speed and results. When his staff showed him the after-action reports from the 4th Armored Division, highlighting the improved kill ratios and survival rates in the 37th Battalion, Patton's only question was, why aren't all my loaders doing this? On October 7, 1944, Patton traveled to 4th Armored Division headquarters to see the technique for himself. He watched Walter demonstrate the backward loading method, then watched 3 other loaders match the technique, timing each one with his own stopwatch. 3 seconds, 2.8 seconds, 2.9 seconds. Patton nodded approvingly, a rare smile on his face before turning to his chief of staff and issuing a direct order. Every tank battalion in 3rd Army will adopt this loading method immediately. Any battalion commander who refuses will be relieved of duty on the spot. Any officer who court-martials a loader for using this technique will answer to me personally. It was the order that made Walter's method official. 3rd Army had 11 armored divisions, roughly 4,000 Sherman tanks, and within 2 weeks, the backward loading method was standard practice across the entire Army. Training officers demonstrated it to replacement crews at staging areas in France, and veteran loaders taught it to new arrivals as soon as they joined their units. The technique spread from battalion to battalion through official channels now. No longer whispered secrets or hidden demonstrations behind maintenance sheds. It was official, and it was saving lives. The impact of Walter's method was measurable and immediate. Between October and December 1944, 3rd Army's overall tank kill ratio improved dramatically, shifting from 3.2 to 1 against American forces, 3.2 Shermans lost for every one Panzer destroyed, to 1.4 to 1. For the first time in the European theater, American Sherman crews were destroying German armor faster than the Germans could replace it, a critical advantage that helped push the Allies closer to victory. Crew survival rates increased by 18%, meaning thousands of men who would have died under the old loading method were now coming home to their families. Walter's backward loading method wasn't the only factor in this improvement. Better tactics, increased air support, and the arrival of more powerful Sherman variants also played a role. But it was a significant one, a small change that had a big impact on the battlefield. The success of the technique didn't go unnoticed by other Allied units. 1st Army and 9th Army, which were also fighting in France, began adopting the method in January 1945, and by March of that year, it had spread to the Pacific Theater. Tank crews fighting in the brutal Battle of Okinawa used the same backward loading method that Walter had discovered by accident in France. using it to engage Japanese tanks in fortified positions with greater speed and efficiency. Despite its widespread adoption and proven success, the U.S. Army never officially changed Technical Manual 9-731A. The regulations still stated that loaders should face the breech at all times, but every experienced tank commander knew better. The manual was theory, a relic of a training environment that didn't account for the realities of combat. The backward method was survival, a technique forged in the heat of battle by a desperate young mechanic. For the men in the turrets, that was all that mattered. Walter Kowalski never received a medal for inventing the backward loading method. No formal commendation, no official recognition in Army records. The U.S. military doesn't award decorations for violating regulations, even when those violations save hundreds of lives. But he did receive a promotion, a small token of appreciation for his contribution. On October 15, 1944, Sergeant Miller recommended Walter for the rank of corporal, citing his exceptional performance under fire and innovative contributions to crew efficiency, and the promotion went through without hesitation. Walter spent the rest of the war as a tank loader in the 37th Tank Battalion, a role he had grown into, his once trembling hands now steady and sure. He survived 14 more engagements between October 1944 and May 1945, each one a test of his skill and the effectiveness of his technique. His tank was hit 3 times by enemy fire, but each time the crew survived, in large part because Walter's fast loading had allowed them to destroy the attacking panzers before they could land a fatal blow. By the end of the war, Walter's crew had destroyed 23 German tanks, every round loaded by Walter using the backward method he had invented. His skill had become legendary within the battalion. He could load a 75mm shell in 2.3 seconds flat, even blindfolded. His hands so familiar with the motion that conscious thought wasn't required anymore. It was muscle memory now, a reflex honed by months of combat, a testament to how necessity and desperation can forge mastery. When the war ended in May 1945, Walter returned to his hometown of Detroit, eager to put the horrors of combat behind him. He went back to his old job as a mechanic at the Ford River Rouge plant, a job he had held before the war, and settled into a quiet, ordinary life. He married his high school sweetheart, Mary, in 1947, and they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, raising them in a small house in the suburbs of Detroit. Walter worked at Ford for 41 years, a dedicated employee who took pride in his work, before retiring in 1986. He never spoke much about the war, a common trait among veterans of that era, who often preferred to leave the memories of battle in the past. But the technique he had invented kept saving lives long after he came home. During the Korean War, American tank crews using modified Sherman tanks against North Korean T-34 tanks were trained on the backward loading method at Fort Knox before being deployed to the battlefield. Combat reports from the 1st Marine Division, which fought in the brutal close-range tank duels around the Busan perimeter, noted that loader speed was critical to survival, and Walter's technique gave Marine Sherman crews a measurable advantage. Their average load time was 2.8 seconds, compared to 4 seconds for North Korean loaders, a difference that often meant the first hit and victory. In Vietnam, the last combat-ready Sherman saw action with the South Vietnamese Army, and while the tanks were obsolete by that point, the loading principles Walter had developed were not. Crews operating M48 Patton tanks, which were equipped with 90mm guns, adapted the backward method for their larger shells, finding that the same basic motion, turning your back, feeling for the breech, ramming the shell home, worked just as effectively. The physics of leverage and natural motion didn't change just because the gun was bigger. Even after the introduction of automatic loading systems in the 1970s, variations of Walter's technique remained relevant. The M1 Abrams tank, which entered service in the 1980s, features a semi-automatic loading system, but the human loader still handles the rounds manually before they enter the automatic mechanism. Training instructors at Fort Benning taught modified versions of the backward grip method until the late 1980s, passing down the technique from instructors who had served in Vietnam and knew its value firsthand. In 1993, a military historian named David Johnson, who was researching 4th Armored Division tactics during World War II, stumbled upon brief references to the improved loading method in after-action reports from September and October 1944. Intrigued, Johnson dug deeper, tracking down Walter through veteran registries and military archives. He traveled to Detroit to interview Walter, who was 71 years old at the time, and asked him about the technique. Walter confirmed the story, downplaying his role with characteristic modesty. "It wasn't anything special," he told Johnson. "It was just something I figured out when my shoulder was hurt. I didn't have a choice. I had to load that shell, or we all died." Johnson published a paper about the backward loading method in a military history journal, calling it one of the most significant tactical innovations to emerge from frontline troops during World War II. Based on the improved survival rates in units that adopted the technique, Johnson estimated that it may have contributed to saving 300 to 500 American tank crew lives in the European theater alone between October 1944 and May 1945. That estimate didn't account for the lives saved in Korea, Vietnam, or the decades of training that followed, making Walter's contribution even more significant. Walter died in 2004 at the age of 82, surrounded by his family. He was buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Clinton Township, Michigan, with full military honors. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his 41-year career at Ford, and his devotion to his family, but it made no mention of the loading technique that had changed how American tanks fought. His 3 children attended the funeral, as did 7 other men, all veterans, all former tank loaders. None of them had ever met Walter before that day, but they had learned the backward loading method from men who had learned it from men who had served with Walter in France. They came to pay their respects to the man who had given them a fighting chance to survive, the man whose simple, rule-breaking idea had saved their lives. It was a quiet tribute to a humble hero. The backward loading method remained standard practice for tank loaders until the development of fully automatic loading systems in modern main battle tanks. Even then, crews operating older M48 and M60 tanks continued using variations of the technique through the Vietnam War and into the 1970s. The last American tank crews to use manual loading were the early M1 Abrams tank crews, and even they were taught modified versions of the backward method during training until automation became standard. Today, you can see Walter's service record at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The documents are sparse, listing his rank, his unit, the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, and his dates of service, 1943 to 1945. But there is no mention of the loading technique that revolutionized tank combat. If you request the after-action reports from the 4th Armored Division for September through October 1944, however, you'll find brief, cryptic references to improved loading times and enhanced crew efficiency, small hints of the change that was taking place on the battlefield. The reports don't explain why the loading times improved. They just note the results, a testament to how often frontline innovations go unrecorded in official military histories. At the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky, a fully restored M4 Sherman tank sits on display, its interior preserved exactly as it was in 1944. The loader's position on the right side of the turret is cramped and tight, just as Walter would have remembered it. If you stand where Walter stood, surrounded by the metal walls and the remnants of the ready rack, you understand immediately why he turned his back to the breach. There simply wasn't room to do it any other way, not if you wanted to load fast enough to survive. The museum's placard describes the Sherman's specifications, its armor thickness, its gun caliber, its engine horsepower, and mentions in passing that American tank crews developed innovative tactics to overcome the Sherman's disadvantages against German armor. But it does not mention Walter Kowalski. It does not mention the backward loading method. It does not mention that sometimes the most important innovations in war come not from generals in headquarters or engineers in laboratories, but from scared 20-year-old mechanics trying not to die. That's how wars are won, after all, not by superior equipment or grand strategies, but by ordinary people making split-second decisions under fire, by mechanics who figure out better ways to load shells, by soldiers who break the rules when the rules don't work. Walter Kowalski never claimed to be a hero. He was just a left-handed kid from Detroit who couldn't use his right arm and had to find another way to load a tank shell. In doing so, he saved his own life and the lives of hundreds of other tank crewmen. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, a tribute to the quiet courage of the men who fight wars without ever making the history books. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. Every like helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II, stories of ordinary men and women who did extraordinary things in the face of impossible odds. Subscribe to our channel to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we have many more to share. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from military veterans to history enthusiasts, and every one of you is part of something special here. A group of people who care about preserving the stories that too often get lost to time. Did you have a family member who served in a tank unit during World War II? Have you heard other stories of frontline innovations that saved lives? Share them with us. We read every comment, and we love to build connections through these shared histories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. They are the stories of our past, and they remind us of the courage and resilience that lies within ordinary people when faced with extraordinary challenges. We'll see you in the next video with another forgotten story from the Second World War.